Hi, 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 and hey, hey, folks. Welcome back to Ken Michaels Radio, where we're always talking about the Beatles here. And, it's been a while since I did this concept of a show. I just brought back my Beatles trivia show for the first time in a year. And it's been a while since I did this concept that I call Youngblood. Now, the song Youngblood, I hope you all know, is an old coaster song that the Beatles used to cover. They did it on their Dick Audition recording, they did it for BBC Radio, and at the concert for Bangladesh. Leon Russell and George Harrison and the band jammed on the song Youngblood. So I thought I would take that title of a song and turn it into an idea where I interview young Beatle fans. By young, I mean 40 and under. I was hoping to have a third guest who might join us. He might just interrupt us, which he's wont to do at times, in the middle of this show, but I'm not sure. But anyway, let me welcome my two guests to the show. First of all, he's been on quite frequently on my channel. He's a great guest to have. He is the author of George Harrison in the 1970s, and he's also a music journalist who writes for Record Collector. Gotta show these two issues right here. This came out the end of 2023, an all Paul McCartney issue. This one came out the end of 2024, all John and Yoko. He wrote an article on Paul's new album here. He wrote an article on Menlove Avenue, the album in here. And hopefully in about a week, maybe 2 weeks, I'll be getting him back on the show to talk about his articles with the editor of the magazine. And that is Owen Lynn. Welcome back.
Thank you. Yes. I appreciated the shout out you, Dino, and Beatley Tone did on one of the shows where you mentioned the magazines, and I can say because I only contributed one article to both magazines, I can say they're both objectively triumphs. They're must buys. They're just. It was a dream come true to contribute to. This was like what I wanted to do when I was 14, 15, and to have these experiences is
Yeah.
a wonder beyond words.
Yeah, well, they're both outstanding issues. And even though I've said this before to anyone who hasn't catch me saying this, the John and Yoko one is so amazing because it does cover all of Yoko's works too.
Mm.
Even covers Julian and Sean in there. So there's quite a lot to learn and a lot of reviews of all their works. So if you can, please make sure to pick that up, and we'll cover that more in a future show with
Okay.
Owen and Daryl Easley, who's the editor of the magazine. And we
Mhm.
also have a fresh face to bring to you here on this channel, Kyle Hand, who is an avid supporter of all my shows, including the podcast Things We Said Today and Talk More Talk. He listens to my radio program. Yes, I do radio too. A lot of people think of me only as a podcaster, but I have my syndicated Beatles show, Every Little Thing. He listens to that too. And he follows this channel. So he's going to be in my will sometime in the future because he's probably the biggest supporter I know. Well, there's a few others, but they're a handful. And so, Kyle, welcome to the show.
Hey everyone, thanks Ken. Thanks so much for having me. As you've stated, I'm a huge admirer of your work. I told my fiance before I came on, I said, "Don't worry, honey, I will remember you after I'm famous on Ken Michaels' radio YouTube channel." So yeah, I'm thrilled to be here. Have a great conversation with you too.
All right. Well, that's news to me, your fiance.
Oh
That must
yeah,
be new.
um, yeah, it's fairly new. Last year, that'll actually be featured in one of my answers to your questions.
Okay. All right. So the whole idea behind this is to get opinions from younger fans to get a different perspective on how a younger mind might think, might be different than us older folks. Okay, so we have a few questions lined up for the two of you. The first one is, what Beatles album have you listened to more than any other in your, albeit short, lifetime so far? Now, I'm going to be very open-minded here. This could be not only the British albums, the core albums, so Please Please Me through Let It Be. It could be American albums. It could be a greatest hits album. It could be the Beatles one. It could be the Red or the Blue collections. Whichever one you want to pick, is there one album that stands out, not necessarily as your favorite, just one that you recall so far you've listened to probably more than any other? So, Kyle, why don't we start with you?
All right. So, Ken, I'm going to test your open-mindedness right at the start here. I brought with me the White Album, the Easter demos specifically.
Ooh.
So, a little bit of background here. I was just really diving deep into the Beatles and Solo in the fall of 2018 when this came out. And I think that what was so magical about it, and why I think I've listened to it more than anything else, was that I knew so little about the Beatles. Everything was just new. It was just new albums, new material. Didn't like they just came from like a different world. Like I didn't have to know the
Mm,
history or anything.
right.
In fact, I knew so little about the Beatles that for the first year I listened to this, to me it was the Escher demos. That's no offense, Owen. Um, yeah. So I I think that what was so magical about it though was that just it really felt like being a fly on the wall to these sessions and everything.
Mm,
Just hearing them laugh, hearing them talk, hear these just radically different versions of songs. I mean, the only one I'd say the most radical difference is Obla Di Obla Da. But I just remember feeling like the coolest guy in college, being like, "Oh yeah, you've heard of Revolution? Now listen to this version of Revolution."
mm.
So and then that was the last box set. Or I guess the last box set I was kind of like just dipping my toes in the water. Then ever since then, I've just been so excited for each new box set, all the new material. So that one has a super special place in my heart.
Mhm.
Right. All right. The White Album to me is the best of all the Beatle box sets because there's more material to pick from, obviously. But you had all the outtakes plus the Esher demos and the remix, which to me is never as important as everything else. But yeah, there's so much there to study. And one of the things that I've learned in recent years is that, I've said this a lot in my shows. To me, the song is more important than the recording. And when you listen to just a demo and it's just one person on a guitar or one person on a piano and it's good by itself,
Mhm.
naked like that, then you realize how good the songs are. But of course, that's also with the knowledge of, how the songs were going to develop later on. But
Mm,
yeah, I love those demos too. And to have so many of them, and it shows how prolific they were when they
Mhm.
were in India, plus the other songs that they didn't release or they gave to other people like Sour Milk Sea and that stuff, or the songs that they released or like George released Not Guilty and Circles later on. To hear those early versions is really fascinating. So you're really pleased with most of the box sets or all of them or what?
I think that they're at varying qualities. Like I liked Let It Be, didn't love it. I feel like it kind of with this being the first one, it kind of lacked like the value, of just so much to it.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, it's kind of a controversial take, but I kind of like where the McCartney camp is going with their box sets right now, because in absence of archive series, which I have hope is going to come back one day, I don't mind these kind of like, you know, offhand, kind of randomly feeling releases of like singles box set, one hand clapping, abandoned projects type thing. So in that vein, if we get cold cuts next, I'll be like, okay, as much as I want London Town or Press to Play box set, like cold cuts would be pretty cool. So yeah, I've been satisfied. And also, if it's too much money, I don't mind going digital too, because it's all out there, and I just want to hear the material.
Yeah, right. I don't really have to get all the big box sets, the Uber stuff, the big all things must pass $1,000 box set, or for my games. To me, it's all down to the music, which is the most
Mhm.
important for me. But when it comes to box sets, specifically the box sets, McCartney
Yeah,
stuff has been inconsistent
yeah.
in how good it can be. Some of them are great. Some of them kind of feel like he's not giving you enough with unreleased.
Hmm.
But that's my opinion anyway. So you think that, and I don't expect that you or even myself have written down every time I've listened to a Beatles album to know, what the stats are. But you think that the White Album would be the one you've listened to more than anything else, even more than any solo album too.
So yeah, so specifically issue demos, to be clear, and the reason I would say that is because even though this was a very active time of like discovery where everything was new, I
Mm,
still felt like it was just this little gift that like only I knew. I wasn't listening to Beatles podcasts where everyone was talking about
mm.
this. As far as I knew, like it was a private Spotify link just for me. And so I think that kind of helped me just like hold on to it like a little bit longer. And who knows, maybe there's some like romantic retrospection of like that summer lasted a lifetime. But um, yeah, I would guess just because now it's like we're just it's an embarrassment of riches. I can just jump from one obsession to the next, and
Mm.
anyone that knows me knows that I get obsessed really quick and over it just as quick. So,
Uh-huh.
I jump around a lot. But yeah, I would say I'm confident with this answer that it's my most amount of minutes listened to.
Okay, very good. It's a great expression, embarrassment of riches, because that's what we have
Hmm.
as a Beatles fan.
Hmm.
All right, Owen, what Beatles album have you listened to the most?
Okay, so in 2007, 2008, I was 14 years old. And there are three art forms from that period that elevated me from that elevated my intellect, my adolescence, my whatever you want to call it. There was The Maltese Falcon, the book by Dashiell Hammett, which I think elevated my taste in literature.
Uh-huh.
You had The Dark Knight, which came out in the summer of 2008, which I think elevated my taste in cinema. And in between those two, we had Revolver, which elevated my taste in pop music. And I can safely say, although it may seem boring compared to the Escher demos, it may seem like a basic bro answer, but yes, Revolver is the album I've probably listened to more than any other album on this planet. I, it's it ties with Forever Changes by Love as my favorite album of all time. I think it just the I mean, you've got three songwriters who are just at the peak of their powers. McCartney's coming out with these wonderful ballads. Lennon's reinventing the rock form, and Harrison's coming up with these terrific guitar solos and melding Indian instruments. And Ringo probably has never been finer as a drummer. And as well as that, you've got George Martin encouraging all these great production techniques. It sounds like it was recorded in August 1966. Just the best summer England had ever had, with winning the football and wonderful record high weather. It just sounds like it was a wonderful time, and it all is there on the album. And it might be the last time the four of them were working together as a team, as a band. Of course, Sergeant Pepper and the White Album, it's much more overdubs or doing things separately. And when they came back for Let It Be, it was hard to get that band fusion back into place, as we see in both Peter Jackson and Michael Lindsay Hogg's works. But in Revolver, it's all there. It sounds fantastic. I've listened to it in secondary school. I listened to it during my school exams. I listened to it in university. I've had Revolver in the background when I've gone backpacking. I mean, I've probably made love to that album. I mean, it's just. I mean, it's just a.
Oh, there.
I okay, we won't go there. Okay. Oh, okay. Well, this episode is rated 15, but we it's just I've that album is basically a family member to me now, Revolver. So that's the answer to that question.
Yeah. But it just fascinates me how that album has really, it's looked upon as being like the number one Beatles album now. And
Mm,
I'm fascinated by change in people's attitude
yeah,
and because I grew up with Sergeant Pepper being heralded as the number one album of all time, nothing can top
yeah,
it. And now a lot of people point to Revolver. And it- coming from someone who grew up on the American albums first, I
yeah,
can certainly understand later on why people feel that way about Revolver because having those three extra songs makes such a big difference on the British album.
yeah,
And to jump from Rubber Soul to Revolver,
yeah,
it's
yeah.
like completely different bands in a way. So
I know. I don't understand George Harrison saying that. If Rubber Soul and Revolver sounded like part one and part two, it's like Tomorrow Never Knows is far more advanced than basically anything on Rubber Soul, as
right.
fine an album as that is.
If anything, Revolver and Sergeant Pepper are closer to me than Rubber Soul
Mhm.
and Revolver.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I agree with that.
All right. So my second question is basically the same one, only applying to Solo Beatle album.
Mhm.
What Solo Beatle album, and this includes Wings, even though some people separate Wings from Paul and whatever, includes Wings, Fireman, Traveling Wilburys, you name it. What album have you listened to the most? We'll start with Owen.
Well, if we're listening to the most, and this is not applied to my current taste, I'm 31 years old. I'm where I am at this point in my life. But if we're talking historically and listens, and especially considering how much more free time I seem to have as a teenager to listen to albums, it has to be Band on the Run, which I actually bought in the summer of 2008. It was money I bought. I ordered it either from eBay or Amazon, but it was the first album I bought online in 2008. Well, obviously it was my parents who bought it, but I gave them the money. It was my pocket money, and there it came in through the door, and I unwrapped it, and there's the photos of McCartney, Denny Lane, Linda in Africa. Great music. I mean, I listened to it as I went to an Irish speaking summer camp in Mayo. Just listening to it, I have memories of looking over the hills, listening to Mamunia and and No Words, and then of course I kept listening to it over the years. It was on all my iPods, and I played at quite a few college parties. You know, it was just getting people to sing along to Band on the Run and Jet, and and I mean once or twice. In the to try and chill people off, we'd put on Bluebird because it's a quite a sensual number, and as in let's not rock out, let's bring everything down.
Yeah.
It's so I mean as I've said on your show a few times, I've said that album, it has dipped in my estimation in that I don't think it has the same textures as say a Venus and Mars or a Tug of War, which I consider McCartney's finest work. But if we're talking about just listening to it, it has to be Band on the Run because it is a party album. It is a kind of a go poppy album, and yeah, it's been a mainstay in my life.
Yeah, some of the albums that are more party albums or more upbeat albums you listen to more.
Mm.
As much as I revere Plastic Ono Band, it ain't a party album.
No,
I'd much rather
Kiss.
listen to Walls and Bridges and Mind Games and Imagine over
Yeah,
Plastic Ono
yeah.
Band, while
You're not
recognizing
gonna
that album is.
you're not gonna put on Simply Shady if you want to like rock out for the night.
I don't know. There's an edge to Simply Shady if you listen real carefully.
Maybe Ding Dong.
Ding dong. Yeah.
All right, Kyle, how about you?
All right, Ken. So I promise I am not placating you, but I would be lying if I said you didn't have a role in my love of this album. We, of course,
Ooh.
have pressed to play.
Definitely in my will. We're screwing that
Yeah.
up right now as we talk. So what I
Yeah.
press to play, and how much of an influence have I been? Build it up,
Yeah.
Kyle.
Yeah. So, um, with press to play, I, if we actually had a tabulator when it comes to minutes, and it stopped up to like 2 years ago, it would probably be RAM, just to all those
Mm.
early days, hours of just like, again, kind of like the Easter demos of like just feeling like something came in from outer space, long haired lady, RAM on, like just
Mhm.
absolutely enamored. But I
Hmm.
really think that press to play has surpassed it in minutes in the past 2 or so years. Um, so out the gate, I would just say that it kind of quintessentializes what I feel is so special about McCartney as an artist is that he's somebody that enacts complete control over the whole soundscape. And I feel like you see that with his sketches of, on the
Hmm.
press single and everything. That's how I grew to love it, but to be honest, I was not really into it right away when I first heard it. With Ram, love on first sight. This one, just it took some more time, and it was kind of a funny story where I work at a law firm, and it's like a music and film law firm, so they didn't really question it when I brought my I purchased a second record player and brought it into work so that when I'm doing some kind of like clerical mindless work, I throw on the headphones and the record player. I don't have it there anymore. I feel like I kind of grew out of that. But anyway, I was just doing some like mindless work, and I think that my boss might have said something cross to me, and I just was like, you know what? I just want to put music all the way up to 10.
Uh-huh.
And that's when I fell in love with press to play. When I really heard like the double tracked guitars, just all the whole, all of the textures, I
Yeah.
was like, wow, we're really onto something here. So then I think that's when my obsession began, and I would just go home at night. And now it's not a work album; it's a sit and sitting down music album, he says, um, and yeah, and then I fell in further into the rabbit hole of the pizza and fairy tales.
Uh-huh.
Oh, you know, okay. And the last thing I'll mention, I totally was not planning on bringing this up, but when Paul did his Bowery show, and I was one of the crazy individuals standing outside trying to listen and
Yeah.
waiting for him to come out, I had one chance to yell one thing at Paul McCartney passing by.
Yeah.
And Yvonne's the one. I just kept.
Did he hear you?
I think so. There is video evidence of him turning his head because I'm yelling it, and then he's about to go in the cab, and there's like a silence, and I say, Paul turns his head, Yvonne's the one. So we could, yeah, I'd like to open a dialogue about it, but I just love Paul in the '80s. So yeah, there's that.
Have you heard 10cc's version of Yvonne's the One?
Yeah, two thumbs down, in my opinion. I think it strips all the good parts out of it. I mean,
There's sometimes, and obviously I have no proof of this, but I know that Paul listened to the radio a lot. And sometimes when I would hear a song like With a Little Luck, I'm thinking it's got that soft rock sound that New Kid in Town had, so maybe he's just doing it his way. And when I hear Yvonne's the one, I think of Laura from Christopher Cross, because that's also in a very high register, very pretty ballad. And I'm sure he heard Christopher Cross's music too, but
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering if he was influenced by that. But anyway, yeah, um, it's a shame. Sam Wiles, who was the other person I was alluding to before, who might join us during this show, we did a show right here on this channel about whether or not Paul was so-called lost in the 80s. And I
Mm-hmm.
really hate that whole attitude of, Tug of War was great, but he didn't find his own until Flowers in the Dirt, you
Yeah.
know. And all that stuff on Press to Play and in between in between with Phil Ramone and David Foster, and he was working with them then. Some of that stuff is absolutely fantastic. And, you know, he released some of that stuff in dribs and drabs, on
Mm-hmm.
his singles like Same Love and, stuff
Mm-hmm.
like that. But that was a great period to me. And
Mm-hmm.
but you just said that McCartney is the master of the sound there, but don't you think Hugh Padgham played a very big part in that in Press to Play?
hmm. You can never know enough when it comes to Beatles World. I'm waiting for Legacy 3 to learn more about Hugh Padgham's. No, not that I need to wait for that. I think that you know, maybe kind of going back to what I said about the Easter demos, it still kind of feels like this magical, piece of material that it's just a funny thing. Sometimes like the less you know, the more magical it seems. But
Hmm.
now you're inspiring me that I gotta hit the books and learn a little bit more about his role.
Yeah, but also, you know, Press to Play. There's certain Beatle fans that grew up in the 60s and 70s and didn't like the production of the 80s. And a lot of people now call that time period very dated.
Mm-hmm.
How do you relate to that? Do you feel like
Um,
very much in a time capsule, or do you think that it still sounds fresh and contemporary today? And does that matter to you?
well, that's kind of what I appreciate about this format we're doing with Youngblood, and in the bigger picture of how Beatles being now like a legacy of, excuse me, like 60 plus years of fans, fans can come at it from all different angles and experiences. So what you spoke to about the fans having been familiar and used to a sound in the 60s and 70s, now the 80s, it's not cutting it for them. Whereas for me, I like my parents kind of like 80s music, but I'm not really familiar so much with the 80s. For
Hmm.
me, like the 80s just feel like this strange and beautiful period between McCartney's like somewhat conventional
Yeah.
tug of war and more conventional Flowers in the Dirt, conventional Flaming Pie. I mean, jumping like a decade, but you get what I mean.
Right.
So, well, I'll bring this up later, but that's how I feel kind of about all the Beatles work in the 80s and even other artists too. So, no, I mean, the thing is that people have an issue with like the gated kick drum sound when it's like
Mm.
done when it's like overused, right? But
Hmm.
like if you put it in the hands of Paul McCartney, like he's gonna do it right, At least that's my opinion.
Mhm.
Okay. Well, obviously, I respect your opinion and everyone that comes on this channel. There'll always be people who will say, well, back in the 60s, the Beatles started the trends, and here they're all trying to, cash in on the latest trends and work with the producers that were, the flavor of the month kind of thing. So then,
Mhm.
you have people who express that opinion. I could see both sides, but I also see that Paul was so adaptable that he could fit in any style of music, you know.
Yeah.
And yet at the same time, you take a song like Good Night Tonight, which a lot of people labeled as disco. Lawrence Juber has told me on numerous occasions it's not disco. It doesn't sound like all the other disco songs that were out at the time. So
Mhm.
he did things his own way, and yet he
Mhm.
still was recognizing whatever the new sounds were and the new trends were. So he still did things his own way. Press to Play doesn't sound like necessarily a Phil Collins record.
No.
Mhm.
So I think that it takes a certain talent to inject whatever it is, the qualities that you have in the music, and bring it to all these new
Yeah.
sounds yourself.
Yeah. And that also kind of speaks to his mastery as an artist that you could describe him as like it's an oxymoron, but like an authentic chameleon. Like he can fit all these different forms, but he's always himself.
That's
Like on the Two Legs Sunday live stream, myself, Beatley, Tone, and Andy, we with the commenters, the audience, we came up with a fantasy Paul country compilation in
uh,
honor of Look Up, and the suggestions from the audience were just incredible. And now we have this beautiful like 14 track playlist of all Paul original rights solo songs. That's like a really convincing country playlist.
right.
And yet that's just like a sliver of that's like you would never associate Paul as a country artist, right? But that's his genius to me. And I
Yeah,
think that's why we keep coming back.
he dabbles in everything. It's
Mhm.
like I love when he does the music hall stuff when I'm
Hmm.
or and you gave me the answer and baby's request. But he doesn't do it
Mhm.
that often. I wish he'd do it more, but he sprinkles some of his albums with stuff
Mhm.
like that. Yeah, the dance music that he does. He doesn't do it that
Mhm.
often, but he does it once in a while.
Well,
It's kind of unique that when he did Kisses on the Bottom, that he did a whole album of standards.
mhm.
Because you wouldn't picture him doing a whole album of country, you know, although he
Yeah.
could.
That's he certainly could, and we have the evidence.
What were you
Yeah.
going to say, Owen?
I was just going to say sometimes Paul actually needs some encouragement. I mean, this is going to sound like a little bit of a name drop, but during the summer, last summer, I interviewed press play producer Hugh Padgham, and he told me the story of that the two of them were discussing who should play on the album, and Paul says, "Yeah, that's not very good. Who should play bass?" And Hugh Padgham's like, "What?" But that's it. That Paul McCartney had lost, like he'd lost faith in his bass playing, probably because the Pino Palladinos and all these slap bass players had come along. So he probably thought he probably thought maybe I should leave that to the younger generation. I mean, sometimes so I suspect if someone maybe if he has the support from the fans to say why don't you release a country album, he could release a country album with the encouragement.
Interesting. It's like I pointed out sometimes that there are certain albums, like on Broad Street, there are moments when he's not playing the bass. You know, the
Mhm.
certain songs on Tug of War and Pipes of Peace where Stanley Clarke is playing the bass. Of course, you got Stanley Clarke in the room, you know, you kind of have to give him a bass, although they can play bass together. But yeah, that's interesting that he would be, lack some faith in his own ability there, at least at the time. All right. So, my third question, what has been the greatest experience you've had as a Beatle fan so far? Now, this could be when a certain album came out, a certain song, seeing a film, maybe you saw A Hard Day's Night in the movie theater. It's the greatest thing that ever happened to you. Or a personal experience, like yelling out Yvonne's the one. All right, this time, Kyle, you go first.
Okay. Yeah, so this one I thought a lot about. At first, my answer in the envelope sealed was going to be just McCartney Legacy coming out and just reading that on the train every day and just tearing through the pages. And then I brought it up to my fiance, who, gently reminded me of an important Beatles memory that we share. That if I care about our relationship, which I do, I ought to change my answer. No, but in all sincerity, this was hands down the best Beatles related memory that I have that I feel like kind of shows just how important the Beatles are to my life and to my family's lives and everything. So the story begins where Phoebe and I, who you've met, Ken, we very normal, like, gosh, you shouldn't have to call your relationship normal. Anyway, I'm just saying that like we didn't have we when it comes to getting engaged, like we talked about it, right? Like nothing was really going to be like a surprise, right?
Mhm.
Like we went and got the ring together, like she knew everything about it. But I just wanted there to be some element of surprise. And so even though we had this whole trip to Paris planned, and according to her, I was going to get engaged and propose in Paris, there was a Beatles cover band Valentine's Day show coming up, and
Uh-huh.
the ring was going to be ready a little bit early. And so I messaged them online. The band is called Walrus. They do this every year in Brooklyn, Valentine's Day. They play Beatles love songs. And so I messaged them on Instagram and I asked, like, hey, big ask, but like if I could come up on stage and like propose to my girlfriend, during your concert, that would be like a dream come true.
Hmm.
And I really thought I would be like imposing and everybody would be like, just boo, back to the music. But like the band was so like they loved it, like they were so excited, like someone's gonna propose at our show, and the everybody in the audience was so excited. So in between sets, they called me on, and I grabbed Phoebe's hand and we went up on stage. She, according to her, she was so surprised that she thought that she was gonna sing a song. um,
Huh.
and so I just kind of rattled off like this little, not really a poem, but I just like tied together like Beatles song titles into
Yeah.
the proposal. And even though the proposal was special, even better than that was like the moments before when I knew I was going to do it, and just her not having anything like her life about to change, just like dancing with her just to all of these like amazing Beatles cover songs. That is, yeah, just of course for will forever cement the Beatles into our lives.
That's absolutely beautiful.
Thanks, Ken.
Yeah. Owen's crying.
That's the most. Well, okay. Jokes aside, that is genuinely one of the most romantic things I've heard.
Oh,
Mhm.
thanks, Owen.
Did the band do My Valentine?
No, the only solo thing they did was What Is Life, and given the story, I will not be one to criticize them, but I think that the fans can fill in the blanks about how I feel about that, leaving some gold on the table there.
That's right. Boy, if there's ever a song that was made for Valentine's Day, if you're a Beatle fan, it's like Paul performs on Valentine's Day at the Bowery Ballroom. You think he's not going to do My Valentine?
Yeah.
You were
He is kind of
my
predictable.
Valentine.
What song is Paul going to do if he's in Kansas City? What song is he going to do when he's in San Francisco?
He's never performed "Give Ireland Back to the Irish" when he plays in Dublin.
Okay, we'll have to work on that with him.
Yeah, and
Mm.
didn't we want him to play "Backseat of My Car" when he was in Mexico City?
Yeah, he sang just a line from it.
Oh, he did do it. Oh, okay, I take it back.
It's on YouTube, as a matter of fact.
Oh,
He didn't do the
yeah,
whole song, though.
naturally.
That would have been perfect.
Yeah.
All right, Owen, what's been the greatest experience you've had as a Beatle?
Uh, as a Beatle fan, well, I mean, following from that, I mean, I can't say I proposed to someone, but I did meet Pete Best face to face to do a 15 minute, 12 to 15 minute interview. So I think that has to be my. It happened spontaneously. It was 5 years ago. I just heard that Pete and Rogue Best were in Dublin.
Okay.
That they had some shows coming up that were inevitably postponed due to COVID, and I just winged it. I just contacted Rogue Best, and I just blagged my way there, thinking he was going to say absolutely no way, and then he said, "Come along tomorrow," or "Come along in 2 days." So I just had my nice leather jacket, thinking he made me look like I was in Hamburg,
Uh-huh.
and or my Barbour jacket. And I went there, met Roisin Ingle, and I thought, yeah, I'm just going to be shown the door. I go inside, I see Pete Best, I say, right, that's enough for me. I'm going to be shown the door. And they said, well, we can get after Roisin, we can give you 10, 15 minutes to speak to Pete Best. And all the way through, I think, when am I going to be shown the door? But suddenly I'm there. I have my recording device. I'm looking at Pete Best, and he's answering my questions, and he seemed impressed by my knowledge. And he went on social media afterwards saying this young man was very knowledgeable, and I, I, I will. I mean, if you listen to the recording, I put it on SoundCloud. I sound like something from the 1940s from BBC. There's a lot of So when you're with the Beatles in Hamburg, because I was trying to hide my nerves and hiding the fact I was like, I'm in the room with Pete fucking and we're trying to keep it all there, and I'm it's very good, very good, and so of course after you left the Beatles, you of course joined this band, and tell me about Hayman's Green, and of course there was the 14-year-old and he was jumping up
Uh,
and down, and as I say, the shows were, and I apologize for I accidentally dropped an F-bomb there. I do apologize to the listeners.
okay.
Thank you. So in September 2022, finally he got to do the show in Lost Lane, and I met Jason Carty from Nothing Is Real, who I'm pally enough with. For
Hmm.
those who don't know, Jason and I, we have similar hair, we're a similar height, we've possibly got similar. No, I'm not going to insult Jason and say we've got similar voices, but aesthetically we look fairly similar.
Uh-huh.
And there's a very funny story. We meet, Jason goes up to Pete, and Pete says, "Are you the guy who interviewed me?" And Jason said, "No, that's the guy over there." And he pointed at me. So, yes, my two interactions with Pete Best. And then Pete Best said to me, "Oh, I thought you were Jason. I thought Jason was you." And so, two great interactions with Pete Best. I think that has to be my favorite Beatle fan memory.
Okay. We got to get you and Jason together on this panel and see if we can tell the two of you apart. Yeah,
Well,
I've met Pete a number of times. Super nice guy. And
indeed.
just in case anyone doesn't know, he's doing 4 concerts next month in the New England area. And one of them's in Rhode Island. I should be going to that one. There's one in New Hampshire, one in Massachusetts, and one in Hudson, New York. So the dates are on my website. But yeah, he's great. I love talking about Hamburg, especially, and
Mm-hmm.
his relationship with the Beatles then. So that's a
Yeah,
great story right there.
it is. He's got by far the thickest Liverpool accent of all of them.
Uh, yeah, well, he hasn't left.
Mm,
He's still there at 8 Hayman's Green.
mm.
Yeah. All right. Final question, or maybe I'll sneak in another one.
Mm.
Um, what's the most fascinating period to you in Beatles history, including the solo years? If you could pick a year or a group of years clumped together, what fascinates you the most? You know? Um, and it could be anything from the solo careers too.
Mm.
I always go on about 1973 and how magical a year that was in the solo careers with 5 albums from 4 Beatles. So, Owen, you'll start.
Well, thank you very much. So, not to be glib about it, because it was fairly horrendous, but it has to be the 1980s because it's everything for about 10 years is reaction to John Lennon's murder. So there's some wonderful decisions, there's some very baffling decisions, and you've got three men trying to figure out where they are in a world without John Lennon. And by the 1990s, with the rise of Britpop, they can McCartney and Starr can like coast on their legend as ex Beatles, because Oasis, Blur, they're all talking about these brilliant men. They're all espousing the virtues of Revolver and Rubber Soul. But for the 1980s, the band are seen as fairly uncool in the UK, and there's the fact that they're in their 40s, which so they're not young but not old. There's three of them who are surviving without their leader, and how do they stay relevant? So we get interesting projects. We get some fantastic albums like Tug of War. We also get these weird divergences like Broad Street and Shanghai Surprise, which the artists came to regret. We get Live Aid, which has an embarrassing moment of McCartney losing his sound going away.
Hmm.
You've got so it's You've got Ringo wondering whether he's a musician or what's he, or is he an actor? What's he coasting? So three guys not knowing where they're going and not entirely sure. And at the end of the decade, George has had tremendous success with Cloud Nine. Paul has a great comeback tour with Flowers in the Dirt. Ringo has kicked the alcoholism entirely, and he's going back on the road with the All Star Band. So then from then on, it's a very different trajectory. So the 60s and 70s, we had like prolific, wonderful careers. 90s onwards, they can all coast on being ex Beatles and being glorified and being knighthoods, etc., etc. It's the 80s, which is the curious one of like, where are they going?
Interesting. Do you think that they were really looking at every move that they were making as though, how are we going to continue without John?
Probably not. That's probably for the authors to. I think they were just going through day to day. It's just. I mean, it's interesting especially for Paul McCartney,
Hmm.
despite the fact that how much he's adored touring for the 1980s, he does not tour. Probably, and he will never admit this, but probably because he was terrified thanks to John Lennon's murder. He just
Yeah.
couldn't. He didn't want to be away from his daughters. He didn't want to put himself at harm's way. Every other decade it's been non-stop performance, except for that one decade where he just wants to stay in England and be with his family and record his music.
Yeah, one big change definitely was that Ringo stopped acting. He made
Mm.
a decision. I'm a musician first. And so, like after Caveman,
Oh God.
really didn't do anything, you know?
Yeah. Well, that's
That
three.
Alice in
Like,
Wonderland special. There was a
well,
TV.
those are three awful films we've just mentioned: Cavemen, Broad Street, and Shanghai Surprise. Shanghai Surprise being by far the worst of them. I only watched that last year for the first time, I think, and it is horrendous.
But George's songs were good.
They were
Yeah.
okay.
But and I don't know if I would necessarily say the solo Beatles coasted in the 90s. I think still everything is a challenge to Paul to keep himself out there and put out good music. His big goal was to continue to make a song that would be considered great. The challenge of that, to keep being able to do that after all he's done already. And considering the fact that he's still so prolific in what he does, you know, it's a big question. It's something we
But
should raise more, I think, on this channel. How did John's death affect the other Beatles and their music? And also, how did the Beatles anthology affect
Hmm.
Well, I think
what happened after that? Because I think Paul gave a lot of credit on Flaming Pie to the Beatles anthology.
mhm.
So,
Well, that's the thing. I think if he released a Flaming Pie style album in the '80s, people would it would have been seen. It would not have been seen. It would not have been as highly regarded as it is now. I've had a similar conversation with Adrian Sinclair because
yeah.
Adrian bought that album and he grew up in England, and there was this sense of like, I mean, he's showing the Britpoppers what he can do. I really don't think there was the appetite for like a Beatles throwback album like Flaming Pie is in the 1980s.
Hmm. Good point.
Yeah,
Excellent.
I agree. And also, I have to interject and say, I have a backup, but Owen, checkmate. That was my choice. The entire 1980s. You said
Wow.
So,
almost everything I planned to say. They're, 40s, not old, not young, et cetera, et cetera. But, I want to pose a question to, the both of you. When I try and explain this to friends, I say that the 80s are the most impressive period for the solo Beatles for me because they're underdogs because the
yeah.
world has like passed them by and they
Mm,
are not just riding on momentum, they are trying all these new things to like still establish their artistry. Do you
mm.
think, is that an overstatement? Can the Beatles ever be underdogs? Like, you know obviously, like Paul is always going to have like, he's not going to have to go crying and begging for like record deals. I don't mean like that kind of underdog.
Uh-huh.
But do you see what I mean? Like the world is moving away from them, and they're not trying to just mimic things to be contemporary, but like I really think that Cloud Nine and Press to Play are some of their best work.
Mhm.
So, oh, over to you.
Yeah, I think you might be onto something. I mean, they're starting from scratch. To me, McCartney releases his two best albums in the early '80s: McCartney Two and Tug of War. And I mean, with McCartney Two, he's like starting the future of music because it's it's an album that sits happily in the 21st century with all the scattered rhythms and and weird freak out vocals and I mean, and it wasn't well regarded critically at the time. There's an interview with Tim Rice where he's basically mocking the album in front of McCartney. Uh, it's- so yeah, I think yeah, I think if there could be a bit. And what I like about McCartney is he releases two experimental albums in the '80s under his own name, Two and Press to Play, whereas in the '90s, it's very much he releases them as the Fireman, whereas he has his commercial music.
Hmm.
That's a really good question, Kyle. I just think that having been a music fan for so long, you begin to realize how much of this business is based on trends.
Yeah.
And I try not to let my opinions be based on that. I don't care if to some people the '80s sound is dated. If I like it now, I still like it. It's not based on what a group of people seem to think for the time being, because that could change 5 years from now and 10 years from now.
Mm-hmm.
But, we weren't used to having rock stars being in their 40s. To a lot of
Mm-hmm.
people, that was considered really old. You
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
what did Paul say so many times? I used to think when I turned 30 that my career would be over, and that's 30.
Mm-hmm.
That's how people thought in those days. And, you know, this entire industry, it's the music that's out there that's being promoted is aimed at young people. And the
Mm-hmm.
thought is that veterans who are out there, whether it's the Beatles or anybody else, really only appeal to the people that grew up with them first, and they're getting older. So don't aim the music towards them. And therefore, that music, the newer music of veterans, sells less. And
Mm-hmm.
then you look at that and you think, well, that must mean that they're not as popular as they once were. Well, the music isn't being pitched to younger people. That's all that it means. But I think that in the '80s in particular, because I started my radio career in the '80s, I definitely sensed a lull in interest in the Beatles. And I think a lot of that had to be because of John's death, because it was
Mm-hmm.
really depressing. Anytime you hear a Beatles song, you tend to think of John. What just happened to him? He didn't just die,
Mhm.
he was murdered. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that left, I don't want to say a bad taste, but it made everybody really sad for a while. And it took a while for things to pick up again, like with Cloud Nine coming out and Paul to tour with Flowers in the Dirt. And then people started to think more positively and bring back good memories and maybe
Mm-hmm.
listen a little bit more to their newer stuff. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
It's a shame that Ringo didn't record anything until Time Takes Time, in between Old Wave and Time Takes Time.
Yeah.
But you had to have a period there when the public wanted a break. And in the 70s, I mean, the Beatles were as hot as a pistol. Between all the compilations that came out, the Red and the Blue did so well, and rock
Mhm.
and roll music and love songs not as well, but still they were well represented on the charts. Got to Get You Into My Life was a top 10 single. The same recording that the Beatles made went top 10 in 1976, and the Beatles' solo careers were doing extremely well. Nobody's
Mhm.
had the success to be that no other group has had the kind of success with their solo careers the way all four Beatles have had.
Mhm.
And that showed in the 70s. And maybe there was a level of burnout because of all that, on top
Yeah.
of getting killed. So we needed a break. I think America needed a break. I don't know about the rest of the world. But do you know how people felt in Ireland, or well, that was still before your time. Oh, and but 80s and 90s, what the attitude was where you
Well, Well, going back to Record Collector, I when I did the piece on Menlove Avenue, I was shocked to find that it stalled at like 127 in the US and didn't
uh,
chart in the UK. I mean, a
Hmm.
John Lennon album. This is doing worse than Sometime in New York City, and everyone considers that a commercial bomb.
right.
127 on the charts. I mean, some that just goes to show that, like, I mean, just how out of fashion Lennon probably was in 1986, because he wasn't Steve Winwood, or he wasn't.
Yeah. But at the same time, following John's death, there was a lot of product that came out on John, and maybe there was too much exposure of John. You
Yeah.
had Milk and Honey, you had Live in New York City, the album
Hmm.
and the video, you had Men Love Avenue, you had the Lost Lennon Tapes radio series, which was glorious. One of the
Yep.
best things that ever happened on the radio. Um, you had a lot of airplay being given to John, and maybe there was too much overexposure with him. I don't know.
Hmm.
It's
Yeah.
but
No.
but I just remember that feeling when I started my radio career in the 80s and I started doing a Beatles show. Yeah, there were people who were really into the solo stuff and the new releases, and they called up and requested the songs, but I still felt like the overall attitude towards the Beatles and interest level had dropped. And I think once the Beatles anthology came out, that really picked things up all over again.
Yeah.
And live at the BBC before that. But the Beatles anthology played a very big part in the revival, if you want to call it that, of the Beatles. And
Yeah.
so many of the moves that Apple has made since then have been brilliant. And they always make sure there's something coming out every year, whether you consider it's a good release or a bad release. So I think the level of interest in the Beatles has been very steady, and there's a lot of young people who are discovering them with digitally, on Spotify or YouTube or whatever. So, but the 80s was like the only time when I can really feel like the interest level dropped quite a bit. And I can't
I,
say I blame them because it was so depressing thinking about what happened to John.
Yeah.
I think that I don't know if irony is the right word, but like the irony is that with that interest level drop, with all the introspection of the murdering of their friend, that's when they just make some of their best music, in my
Hmm.
opinion. They're just
The
not the
war.
type of artists to go hide in a hole and say, "All right, the world doesn't want me. I'll take my royalties and leave." Yeah.
Well, it's also debatable. I don't look at Somewhere in England as one of George's best albums, and that was right after John's death. I love Gontrapo. I think it's extremely underrated.
Me too.
Yeah.
A lot
I
of
agree.
people frown on that album, and the poor performance, which was also due to George not promoting it.
Yeah.
Um, and Tug of War, Paul likes to make the case because it's been brought up to him. Do you do your best work when after you've followed something tragic in your life? Like a lot of people think of McCartney and Ram following the Beatle breakup as being such strong material. Band on the Run after two
Hmm.
members leave. Tug of War after John dies. Flaming Pie while Linda's
Hmm.
goes to death. You know.
Hmm.
Um,
Chaos and creation.
okay. So you think that album was stronger because George died?
I think because his marriage was coming to the end, like there's hints of
That
it, like
too.
writing to Vanity Fair, which I sent this to you on in a private chat on Facebook. I sent you the article in Vanity Fair that the interview Heather Mills gave.
Mm.
Okay. I got to
And I
go
would
back.
count I'll count Run Devil Run in that too, if you want to, the one after Linda's death.
Yes.
Yeah. Um, but you know, I see what you mean of like, okay, the ones are questionable like immediately after, but I feel like just giving them, some, human empathy here of just like, if they have like 5 or so years, 6, 7 years to like really process it. Like I'm much more focused on kind of the late '80s of Press to Play, Broad Street, and Cloud Nine. Like personally, I think that as much as I love Paul's stuff, like super fan, I think someplace else on Cloud Nine might be like my single favorite solo Beatles track
Ah,
among them. And I just feel like there's just a maturity to it that I think that, considering I'm a young blood, I'll only have to grow into, better understanding. But there's just something super magical there. And then also, even if you consider like, Ringo's, sobriety, that's not something, as far as I know, that happens just like, okay, well, something tragic happens, time to clean up my life. Like sometimes it's like something tragic happens and then years go by and then you're like, maybe I have to clean up my life, you
Yeah.
know?
hmm.
Um,
Good point. Good
Yeah.
point.
I think actually Ringo has admitted that one of the tracks on Look Up is about about sobriety and appreciating Barbara Bach.
is it
Oh,
thankful?
thankful.
I think so. Yeah. Yeah. It's pretty. Okay. I couldn't remember.
On the nose, Ringo. Yeah, but we love him for it.
Yes.
All right.
So
Well,
should I mention my backup period, or I'm
sure.
happy
Go
to
ahead.
share the '80s. You know, I would say um, the last thing I read in the Legacy book is probably it, which is the breakup of the dissolution of the Beatles as an entity in was it 1975 when they officially signed the papers?
Mm,
74 was when
74.
the
Is
end
when
of,
they signed.
yeah.
Okay.
Oh, well,
Um,
74, they all signed it, but John was the last to sign it, and that was
Yeah.
in the end of 74. And he
oh,
did,
okay. I remember it was kind of on the brink.
yeah.
Mhm.
But I thought just I don't feel super guilty about giving things away from the legacy book because if I give away like one nugget, there's like a million nuggets, for you to find. So maybe skip ahead, 2 minutes if you're super spoiler averse. But I just feel like all of the like near misses, like of them almost coming together, almost playing together, almost doing shows together. That just I love like fantasy, and like what if scenarios. Like the fact that John and Paul, drunk in New York City at 3 a.m., knocked on David Bowie's door and said, "Let's form a group called David Bowie and the Beatles." Like, like I just feel like it's a time where this group that defined their entire lives is now at least legally gone and they're really trying to find themselves. But it's like they're doing soul searching, but also you wouldn't even know it because Paul just released Band on the Run, it's releasing Venus and Mars, about to go on tour, George doing his tour, and so it's an interesting kind of paradox in both of those areas of their lives.
That's really well put because sometimes, like I think when Paul's lyrics book came out, I was surprised how many solo songs he referred to something that happened in the Beatle days. He's always hearkening back to the Beatles, even though at that time he wasn't talking about it because he had to establish himself on his own. But, the experiences that you have as a young person in your teens and 20s, the first time you did certain things, all the incredible things the Beatles did together, that's something that will always be, something that's a part of your heart, that carries with you for the rest of your lives. And even though you're going on and having successful solo careers, you don't forget about that. There are times when Paul has alluded to wanting to make a, a new album the way we used to do it in the Beatles, where, John and I would write a song and we'd go into the studio and we'd finish it up in a day. He always brings up stuff like that. So, it's a part of him that never leaves. But you want to think that they're so independent on their own because they did so well on their own, and yet every now and then, you can tell how much they love talking about the past.
Hmm.
You know, for a long
Yeah.
time, Ringo was like, don't bring up the Beatles. And now when you do bring it up, he smiles. It may trigger another memory.
Hmm.
It's a part of who they are and they're proud of it, but they just didn't want to have to rely on it all the time.
Hmm.
Right. And even how Paul always peering over the reviews of things, wanting to be critically acclaimed as well, and that he apparently read a review of George's, I guess it was the Dark Horse tour at this time,
Hmm.
um, that the reviewers were upset he wasn't playing enough Beatles songs. And that's
Right.
why, in, Wigs Over America, he included those songs. So it's just a constant battle of like embracing the past or not, because to us it seems kind of like a no-brainer. It's like that's what that was some of your best work, of course you would do that, but they're still young and they want to form their own identities.
Right.
Hmm.
I actually liked it when Paul didn't rely on the Beatles. You
Yeah.
know,
Now we wish it was the other way, don't we, Ken?
yes, do Wings Over America all over again, but
Let me tell you, I loved that show you did with Dino and Tony about the
Hmm.
what songs what do we want Paul to play
yeah.
live. My favorite part was when you're like, really? You think he would play that? And Tony was like, you said we could pick any song.
Yeah, I mean, said, "How do you sleep? Give me a break."
Yeah.
Uh, he ain't gonna do how to
Yeah.
bet this house that he'll never do how do you sleep.
Anyway.
You know
I would
what's
love it though.
Sorry. What's interesting
I w-
about it is all the comments that people wrote in from the show, and a lot of people said take it away. It seemed like
Hmm.
that was like the
Mm.
one song more people voted on, especially because he's got a horn section. You know,
Sure.
but, I find that all very fascinating. Yeah. Owen?
I would love it if he did Pretty Little Head and he just, and he did a rock show of the bass thing. And he really he soloed and just you could see the fingers going down the fretboard and he's nimble enough. He could gyrate and
Uh-huh.
yeah.
Well, we did a show on things we said today with our own McCartney dream concert set lists, and I know that he would never do what I proposed. But I just wish that he would loosen up and just have fun and do whatever the hell he wants, and even do Beatles songs that were John songs that he loves, or other
Mhm.
George songs besides something,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
have fun with his solo career. If he could do Temporary Secretary again, which he did at the last show at the
Mm.
Bowery Ballroom, why can't he do Pretty Little Head? They're both weird tracks. It's not like you're going to alienate the audience there. The same people that love Temporary Secretary probably like Pretty Little Head.
You're actually blowing my mind. I was suffering from a severe bout of FOMO, and I did not look at the track list for the night three of the Bowery.
Oh,
Um, so I'm pleased to know that he did temporary secretary. I just to combine two things with like a big brain thought here. A lot of the people that got tickets, as I've heard, were kind of like young influencer types, which was odd because you couldn't even have phones in there. But in any case, just from my kind of very outside looking in view of like the whole Brooklyn Bushwick scene, like I think young people right now like love temporary secretary. Like they're like, oh, like this guy that like wrote like Let It Be, like
uh-huh.
listen to this crazy thing. Like I think like just the weird, the zany is like
Yeah.
in right now, and the
Uh-huh.
fact, of course, Paul's done it all, so he's got that. And I don't know. I mean, maybe it's a little anecdotal and I extrapolated, but I just have a friend that was like, oh, did you know he made this song? And I'm like, yes, of course, I know he made. But to her, it's like a big deal. So
Yeah.
I wonder if that was not so much for the super fans, but for the young blood.
Hmm.
with a
Interesting.
young
Well, that's
blood.
why that's why I'm doing this series. I hope I do more shows like
Mm,
this because you don't know what young people are thinking. Maybe they love Temporary Secretary and McCartney too. Maybe they would love Press to Play or Driving Rain, which has a lot of experimental stuff, and the first McCartney album, and you know, maybe they'd be turned on by that stuff. Who
I
knows?
love Driving Rain.
yeah.
As you know, one young blood here loves Driving Rain.
I love it too.
Yeah.
It was an album that I liked when it first came out, probably more than liked. Liked it quite a bit. Now I love it.
Mm,
It's just the only problem I have with it, which has been expressed a lot, is that it's too long an album.
yeah.
Mm,
Too many songs. It should have been two CDs or something.
Yeah.
So it's a lot of good stuff on there. But anyway, can I throw one more question out?
I'm
Yeah. Why
begging
not?
you.
I just want to know. I mean, you just mentioned the Esher demos, Kyle, but did you try when it came to the Beatles and their solo stuff to listen to things chronologically, or just you randomly picked anything at any time? And how, if anything, did that shape the way you think about their music, if at all? Owen?
Chronologically, no, definitely not. Just whatever was in my local library in Waterford, I took. So actually, the very first album I listened to was Abbey Road. So like, I'm starting from the end.
Yes.
Uh, Abbey Road was and the last one I listened to was with the Beatles. So it was all very scattered and scrambled. And uh, as for the solo career, yeah, whatever you get your hands on. But I did actually in 2017 when I did a just on a blog. I did a run through McCartney's work with Wings. I did that chronologically, and you could see like the domino effect of what this leads into and it gave me it gave me a new understanding of Wings at the Speed of Sound that I didn't have beforehand, and it made sense to go from Wings to the Speed of Sound. Okay, so that's why he's dialing it all down for London Town. He's going pastoral because he's had two back-to-back stadium albums, and which makes sense that the next stage is that he's going to Back to the Egg, which is a punkier new wave album. So it's sort of in between, folk music and
Uh,
stadium rock. Yeah. So that gave me a better understanding. And when I did the book on George, I listened to things chronologically because I wanted to see how his career was progressing, uh, just in the listening and the research stages.
right.
Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah,
What about John and Ringo?
I have yet to do the pleasure. I mean, yeah, I'm sure I will do that one day with John and probably Ringo.
Okay. Kyle?
Yeah, that's another interesting angle that we come from, especially as like being a digital native as we're called. Like we kind of we have this odd, freedom to kind of just like, well, I guess you kind of had that at a record store anyway, but like it really feels like everything's at your fingertips.
Mm,
So yeah, I mean, well, if it's not already obvious, no, nothing was chronological. But you know, I think that what was bad about this, and that if I could go back and do it again, I think I might have listened a little bit too much to what people were telling me about the
Mm,
albums instead of just going purely, blind, right? Or
yeah.
deaf, as it were. Well, anyway. So for example, like McCartney has so many albums that it's like, where do you start? And
mm,
I think I just Googled like best Paul McCartney albums,
Mm,
and I'm really lucky that this, author put Chaos on Creation at like three.
mm.
And and I got into that one like super early. I think that it was like Ram and then Band on the Run, and I was like, I kind of already know that from my parents, so then I went to Chaos. And so it's interesting angle like that, but then, obviously like not to in any way like make any judgments about my beloved podcasters, which I am so thankful for all this Beatles conversation we get, but like naturally people have opinions. And as
Right.
somebody that hasn't heard all the albums, I can be a little impressionable and not like, oh, they don't like that, let me see how it is. Instead, there's a weird comfort of like knowing and being like, oh yeah, I don't like it either, which
Mhm.
is like wrong. And I, try not to think about that, but I think it's a little human that we do. And so there are
Mhm.
certain albums that I put off for a long time, just thinking that it was like, oh, that album, like who needs.
Mhm.
I can't think of a good example of that off the spot or on the spot, but probably, I mean, Driving Rain might be a good example of
Mhm.
Yes.
that I really wish I had that in my life sooner.
Mhm.
So um, yeah, I think Gone Troppo too. Like I adore that album,
Yep.
but but you're inspiring me, Ken. I want to do a little experiment and just run through it chronologically, just because.
Mm.
What else will I do?
Yeah.
Well, I don't know if I necessarily feel that you have to run through it chronologically. I just wonder sometimes if, let's just say, you're dealing with the Beatles group catalog and you're exposed to the later stuff first, and you have all that hammered into your head, and you may not appreciate the very early music of theirs because of that, because you saw how they really mushroomed and developed the way they did towards the end. You may not have as much of an appreciation as if you were to start from the very beginning.
Mhm.
So
Agreed.
I wonder about that sometimes. You
Yeah, I
always
think it's
see,
hard.
yeah,
I
good.
think it's hard to go backwards, like because there's kind of an unfair, like, or not all, I'd rather say not entirely fair, a judgment that the Beatles' later music is like more sophisticated, which is
Yeah.
like
Mhm.
you can't really argue with that. Like that's true. However, like the unstated assumption or implication there is that the early music is unsophisticated
Yeah.
because the later music is more, but it's like no, it's always been sophisticated.
Yes.
It's always been super, like Ken, like you study music theory and stuff, like
Yeah.
about how impressive those like chord changes and all the new
Mhm.
things they were doing in
Yeah.
like their first albums. So I think it took me a little while, and probably more so like learning and hearing about these things from podcasts to really revisit those.
Yeah.
And even like the American albums too. That was another kind of like podcaster bias thing of, just hearing all these things, or again, I'm not putting the blame at the feet of any podcaster or anything. It falls on me, but I had this, belief that the American albums were just like some invention by some, suit in a New York office. And then
Yeah.
it wasn't until this box set that people were really talking about how important those were and how they were, they sold more. So you could even argue had like a bigger
Mhm.
footprint in the
Hmm.
Beatles' history, that I really began to appreciate those too.
Yeah.
Yeah. There was actual
Uh,
reasoning that went behind the song selections and the sequencing of the songs on American albums. There was more thought put behind that than we realize.
mhm. I'd like to jump on something Kyle said, which is about the he tactfully said how things influence. I mean, I remember being 16 and reading the Norman Suna's book about Fab, and it seemed everyone was down on the Press to Play album. And then when a year as an adult, I got to interview Eric Stewart and Hugh Padgham, and neither of them are too keen on the album. And there seems to be this it wasn't until actually I just listened to the album, listened to the grooves, and listened to the melodies, and as Kyle said, the elements of sonics and the sonic differentiations. That's when it really and Dino mentioned it on another episode that it's a sonic album that it I realized what the album was supposed to be, but all this information seemed to pinpoint that this was a weak album, that McCartney wasn't happy with it, that Hugh Padgham wasn't happy with it, Eric Stewart, that everyone thought it was a mistake. It, and it isn't. It's a very fine in spots.
And McCartney shows a lack of confidence when, if the record doesn't sell well, it
Mm-hmm.
therefore must not be all that good. And
Yeah,
so he doesn't
rubbish.
talk about it. And as you said, both Hugh Padgham and Eric Stewart are not crazy about the album, and therefore Paul was not too crazy about the album because it didn't do well. And you'll never see him do anything from it live
Um,
or talk about it. So, I bet you if Press to Play went to number one on the charts, you'd be saying, that was a pretty good album I made there.
yeah, yeah. People these days come up to me and say they like Pistol.
Well, we need like his son's classmate or daughter's classmate to, say, "Oh, like I put on Press to Play the other night and it was really good." And then Paul's like, "Oh, wow, I should listen to that too." I feel like
Mm.
that's how things mainly re-enter his mind.
Well,
I mean,
now
even
he's realizing Ram was really a good album
Yeah.
because people have reappraised it now.
yeah,
And
He was the last to know.
yeah. But even the cover, I mean, it looks like something stunning from the 1940s.
hmm,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, you could also say that it was kind of similar to John and Yoko on Double Fantasy
Oh, true.
Ooh.
in black and white too.
Oh.
That's very interesting,
Um,
especially considering the talk we just had about John's presence kind of looming over the 1980s.
mhm.
Hmm, who knows? Anyway, this has been an amazing conversation here. I
Mhm.
can't thank you guys enough. Sam Wiles, where have you been? We're gonna chew you out the next time that you're on this channel. Anyway, thanks so much, Owen, for playing a part in this. And I want to remind everybody, because Owen will be on soon,
Oh, okay.
these two great issues of Record Collector, one on Paul, one on John and Yoko, really the whole Lennon family. And I'm so impressed with these two issues. You learn so much in just, a
Yes.
few pages.
But,
And
but I mean, it's credit to Daryl Easley. He did a phenomenal job. Whether it was with selecting the writers, uh, he's with the layout, with the research,
mm,
with the brio, with the innovation. Like he was encouraging. I had some email chats with him on both pieces. He gave me some very good ideas that I used. It really, I mean, if we need to give someone a round of applause, it really is Daryl Easley.
mm. And they even do a very brief review of the one-to-one documentary, which obviously they saw because it hasn't even been in theaters yet.
Mhm.
And yet there's no review of Daytime Revolution in there.
Mm.
I have to
And
talk to Daryl about that.
Ken, if I can add, I actually have seen One to One because it was at film festivals,
Okay. Where
and
was this? What festival?
I let's just say I was able to watch it, and it but I all I want to say is that I think that Beatles fans are going to really love this. I think that they're going to really cherish it. I think that it explores, his life and his music and the way that they're intertwined in a very artful way. And I know that fans won't have to wait long. I think it's at least having at least a limited release coming up in the spring.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, I just am so excited for people to experience it.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
it's going to be on HBO later in the year,
Yeah.
Yeah.
but the physical release is the end of the year, I think, for a
It,
DVD and Blu-ray.
it has
I'm
been
not
doing the
sure.
festival circuit.
It's
Yeah.
what?
It's been doing the festival circuit. I mean, I've been to a few film festivals, and it's been doing this film circuit.
Did you see it too?
I haven't seen it. Without going into it, late last year wasn't a great time for me.
Gotcha. But yeah, it was in it was at Sundance Film Festival.
Yes. Mhm.
But yeah, I mean, I saw it kind of a while ago, so I can't speak too much of the details. But I guess ultimately, I've seen so many of these Beatles docs, and I know, it's not going to be like 8 days a week of just talking heads or
Yeah.
of whatever.
Hmm.
I think it's in the hands of somebody that truly loves the Beatles and is an excellent documentarian.
Mhm.
And I don't want to overhype it anymore because it's probably doing the producers a disservice of giving too high expectations. But I learned a lot, and I mean I think just John just deserves this. I mean, so long are the days for those sweeping documentaries about let's tell his entire life story in 60 minutes. Like no,
Yeah.
this is like 1 year or not even a year, just like a very small amount of time, and it gets the attention that it deserves.
Well put. There's too many documentaries
Yes.
that try to cover. Yeah, I was, as much as I love Martin Scorsese, living in the material world had a lot of great moments in it, the documentary, but it jumped from 1974 to John's death and then to the Traveling Wilburys right after that. So
Yeah.
Yeah,
it's impossible to tell the life of someone who's done so much in 2 hours or even
yeah.
three
It was
hours.
that film was a bit too hagiographic for me. But actually, my editor at D Movies, Victor Fraga, who's not really a Beatle fan, he thought the. I'm just reading his review now. He thought the one-to-one film was superb.
Okay.
And if you get that from a non-Beatle fan, I think you're doing like non-Beatle fans love the Get Back series.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good point.
Yeah.
It's going to be a pretty good time for Lennon fans in the next few months because she got one-to-one, which will be in IMAX theaters April 11th. I hope it's more than one day. I'm not sure at this point in IMAX. And then the next month, Borrowed Time, which is another documentary on the last decade of John's life, is going to be in movie theaters. So 2 months in a row, right
Yeah,
there.
nice.
A lot of material. Anyway, guys, this has been tremendous. Thank you, Owen. Thank you, Kyle, for doing this. And we'll have you back on at some point in different combinations. But you have to promise if you're on with Sam, you chew him out.
I think Kyle is a fantastic guest to have on another show.
Yes, you were amazing. First time
Thanks.
here.
Yeah, thank you. I would love to, I'm at your beck and call, Ken. I
Okay. You like
yeah.
doing a trivia show? Either of you?
I'm more of an arguer, but I love listening to the trivias.
I'm wondering how both of you would do in the trivia show. But anyway, it's fun anyway. And it's just, that's all that matters is the fun aspect.
Yeah, I love listening to those. The last one was great too.
Okay. Thank you guys for doing this. Thanks to all of you for watching. And we'll see you next time. Take care.
Hally, hally.